The blood on her dress had long since dried to a rust-brown stain, but Grace Novak could still feel the weight of it pressing against her ribs like a brand. She stood at the edge of Hachita, New Mexico, in the scorching August heat of 1882, watching dust devils spiral across the desert floor, wondering if she had the strength to take another step, or if she should simply let the sun finish what those men had started 3 weeks ago. Her legs trembled beneath layers of torn calico, and the canteen at her hip had been empty since yesterday morning. The town shimmered before her like a mirage, all weathered wood and false front buildings baking under a merciless sky. She had walked for days from the mining camp where her husband had been killed, where she had been left for dead, where everything she had known or believed about goodness in the world had been beaten out of her by fists and worse. Grace did not expect kindness here. She did not expect anything except perhaps a quiet corner to die in, away from the vultures that had been following her for the last 2 miles. Her vision swam as she forced one foot in front of the other, past a hand-painted sign that read, Hachita population 247 ESD, 1875. The main street stretched before her, wide and empty in the midday heat when any sensible person sought shade. She could hear piano music drifting from somewhere, the low murmur of voices, the clop of horse hooves. Normal sounds, sounds from a world she no longer belonged to. Grace made it 3 more steps before her knees buckled. She caught herself against a hitching post, splinters driving into her palms, but the pain was distant and unimportant. Everything was distant now. She had learned to float somewhere above her body, untethered and numb, ever since that night when Frank had tried to defend her against the claim jumpers and taken a bullet to the chest for his trouble. Miss, are you all right? The voice came from somewhere to her left, deep and concerned, but Grace could not make herself care enough to look. She had heard concern before, usually right before someone decided she was not worth the effort. She was too broken, too used up, too far gone. She knew what she looked like with her hollowed cheeks and the bruises still yellowing along her jaw, with her dress hanging off her frame because she had not been able to keep food down for weeks. Miss, you need to get out of this sun. Hands touched her shoulders, gentle but firm, and Grace flinched so violently she nearly fell. The hands immediately withdrew, and she heard the man take a step back. I am not going to hurt you, he said, his voice lower now, softer. But you are about to collapse, and this street is hot enough to fry eggs on. Will you let me help you to some shade? Grace finally raised her head, squinting against the brutal sunlight. The man stood a few feet away, his hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no threat. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a dusty brown vest, with a wide-brimmed hat shading a face that looked to be somewhere in his late 20s. Dark hair curled at his collar, and his eyes were an unexpected green, steady and patient as they met hers. I have no money, Grace heard herself say, her voice cracked and hoarse. I cannot pay you. Did I ask you for money? He tilted his head slightly. My name is Garrett Pierce. I work the cattle ranch about 5 miles west of here. And you look like you are about 10 minutes from dying of heat stroke, so I would take it as a personal favor if you would let me get you some water and a place to sit down. Grace stared at him, trying to find the trap in his words, the hidden motive. Men did not help women like her without wanting something in return. But her body was making the decision for her, her legs finally giving out completely. Garrett moved fast, catching her before she hit the ground, and Grace was too weak to do anything but let him lift her. She weighed nothing, she knew. She had not weighed anything substantial for weeks now. It is all right, he said quietly, carrying her down the street toward a building with a green painted front. I have got you. You are safe now, safe. The word was meaningless. Grace closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. She woke to the sound of women's voices and the feel of cool cloth against her forehead. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in Philadelphia, in her mother's house before the fever took her, before Grace had married Frank and followed him west with dreams of silver and a new life. Then the pain reasserted itself, the deep aches in her body and the sharper agony in her spirit, and she remembered. "She is waking up," one of the voices said. "Grace, can you hear me?" Grace forced her eyes open. She was lying on a narrow bed in a small room with whitewashed walls. An older woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair leaned over her, while a younger woman stood near the door with a basin of water. "Where am I?" Grace managed. "My boarding house," the older woman said. "I am Martha Davis. Garrett Pierce brought you here about 2 hours ago. You have been unconscious most of that time, but we got some water into you and cleaned you up a bit." She hesitated. "We changed your dress. That one you were wearing was beyond saving. I hope you do not mind." Grace looked down at herself. She was wearing a simple cotton nightgown, clean and soft against her skin. The kindness of it made her throat tighten. "I mind nothing," she said. "Thank you." "When did you last eat?" Martha asked gently. "I do not remember. Days, maybe." Martha exchanged a glance with the younger woman, who nodded and slipped out of the room. "We will start you with some broth. Your stomach will not handle much more than that right now. Then we can talk about what happened to you if you want to, or not. That is up to you." "I cannot pay you," Grace said again. It seemed important to keep saying it, to make sure everyone understood she had nothing left to give. "I have nothing." "Garrett already paid for a week's room and board," Martha said, "so you do not need to worry about that right now. You just need to rest and get your strength back." Grace turned her face away toward the wall. A week. They were giving her a week before she would have to figure out how to survive, how to move forward, how to keep living when every part of her wanted to simply stop. It seemed both impossibly generous and utterly inadequate. But she was so tired of fighting and hurting and being afraid. So she closed her eyes and let sleep take her again, even though her dreams were full of blood and the sound of Frank's last breath rattling in his chest. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of sleep and small meals and the quiet routine of Martha's boarding house. Grace stayed in her room most of the time, afraid to face the curious stares she knew awaited her outside. Martha brought her broth and bread, gradually adding more substantial food as Grace's stomach remembered how to digest. The younger woman, whose name was Sarah, left wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill every morning, bright spots of yellow and purple against the desert landscape visible through the glass. On the third day, Martha came in carrying a bundle of clothing. "I thought you might like something to wear besides that nightgown," she said. "These belong to my daughter. She moved to Santa Fe last year and left half her wardrobe behind. You look to be about the same size." Grace took the clothes with trembling hands. 2 dresses, one brown and one blue, both simple and practical. A cotton chemise and petticoat, a shawl for evening. It was more than she had expected, more than she deserved. "Why are you being kind to me?" The question came out before she could stop it. Martha sat down on the edge of the bed. "Why would I not be? You do not know anything about me, what I have done, what has been done to me." "I know you are hurting," Martha said. "I know you need help. That seems like enough reason to me." Grace shook her head. "In my experience, kindness always comes with a price." "Then your experience has been with the wrong people." Martha reached out and squeezed Grace's hand briefly. "Not everyone in this world is cruel, Grace. Some of us actually care about our fellow human beings." Grace wanted to believe her, but the hope was too painful to hold on to. She had believed in goodness once, believed that hard work and love would be enough to build a life. She had been wrong. Frank was dead, and she had been left broken and bleeding in the dirt, and no amount of kindness could undo that. But she put on the brown dress when Martha left, and she managed to eat half a bowl of stew that evening, and she supposed that was something. Small steps. That was all she could manage. Small, painful steps toward whatever came next. On the fourth day, there was a knock on her door in the late afternoon. Grace had been sitting by the window watching the street below, trying to work up the courage to go downstairs. She tensed at the sound. "Grace," Martha's voice came through the door. "Garrett Pierce is here. He would like to see you if you are feeling up to visitors." Grace's first instinct was to say no. She did not want to face the man who had saved her, did not want to see whatever expression would be in his eyes when he looked at her now that she was cleaned up enough to reveal just how damaged she truly was. But he had paid for her room, and she owed him at least a thank you. Debts had to be acknowledged, even if they could not be repaid. "All right," she said. Martha opened the door and Garrett stepped inside, hat in hand. He looked much as he had that first day, dressed for work with dust on his boots and sun-weathered skin. But his eyes were gentle as they met hers. "Miss Novak," he said, "it is good to see you up and about. You have got some color back in your face." Grace remained seated by the window, her hands folded in her lap. "Thank you for what you did, for bringing me here and paying for my room. I do not know how I will repay you, but I will find a way." Garrett shook his head, taking a few steps into the room but maintaining a respectful distance. "I do not want repayment, I just wanted to make sure you were recovering." "Why?" he blinked. "Why what? Why do you care?" "You do not know me. I could be anyone. A thief. A murderer. Why would you spend your money on a stranger?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "My sister died 3 years ago," he finally said. "She was traveling from Texas to meet me here. Her husband had passed, and she was coming to start over. But she got sick on the road, and no one would help her. They were afraid of the fever, or they just did not want to be bothered. She died alone in some nameless town, and by the time I found out and got there, she had already been buried in an unmarked grave." Grace felt something crack inside her chest. "I am sorry. Me too. Every day." He met her eyes. "So when I saw you collapsing in the street, I thought about Emma. About how I would want someone to help her if I could not be there. That is all. No hidden motives. No price attached." Grace did not know what to say. The sincerity in his voice was almost painful to hear. She had armored herself against cruelty, but she had no defense against genuine kindness. "How did you end up in Hachita?" Garrett asked, breaking the silence. "If you do not mind me asking." Grace looked back out the window. "My husband and I were working a silver claim up near Lordsburg. Some men wanted it. We said no. They killed him and left me for dead. I walked here because I did not know where else to go." The words came out flat and emotionless, a recitation of facts rather than a lived experience. It was the only way she could speak of it without falling apart completely. "Did you report it to the law?" "There was no law there. Just miners and drifters and men who take what they want." She turned to look at him. "And even if there had been, what would be the point? Who would care about one dead prospector and his used-up wife?" "I would care," Garrett said quietly. "And I think a lot of people in this town would too. Hachita might not be much, but we look after our own here." "I am not one of your own. You could be, if you wanted." Grace shook her head. "I cannot stay here. I have no way to support myself, and your week of charity will run out soon enough." "Martha needs help running this place," Garrett said. "And the general store is looking for someone to help with the books. You can read and write, I assume." "Yes, but then there are options. I am not saying it will be easy, and I am not saying you have to decide right now. I am just saying you do not have to leave if you do not want to." He put his hat back on, adjusting the brim. "Think about it. And if you feel up to it, maybe you could join us for dinner downstairs tonight. Martha sets a good table, and you should not stay cooped up in this room forever." He left before Grace could formulate a response, his boots echoing on the wooden stairs as he descended. Grace sat in the silence he left behind, her mind churning. Stay in Hachita. Build a new life. Work and eat and sleep and pretend that she was a person capable of moving forward. It seemed impossible. But then again, she had thought surviving was impossible, and here she was, still breathing, still existing, even if she could not quite call it living. That evening, she made herself go downstairs. The dining room of Martha's boarding house was warm and bright, lit by oil lamps and filled with the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread. There were 6 people seated around the long table, including Martha and Sarah. Garrett sat at one end, and he smiled when he saw Grace hesitate in the doorway. "Come in," Martha said, waving her over. "You can sit here next to me." Grace moved stiffly to the indicated chair, acutely aware of every eye on her. But the looks were curious rather than cruel, and no one asked intrusive questions. Martha introduced her around the table. There was an older man named Henry who worked at the livery stable, a married couple named the Johnsons who ran a small farm outside town, and a young man named Tom who was passing through on his way to California. The conversation flowed around her, talk of weather and crops and the upcoming church social. Grace said nothing, focusing on the food on her plate and trying not to feel overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of it all. But she was aware of Garrett across the table, the way he occasionally glanced at her, the way he seemed to be monitoring her comfort without being obvious about it. When the meal was finished and people began to disperse, Garrett caught her before she could escape back upstairs. "That was not so bad, was it?" he asked. Grace shrugged. "I suppose not. Progress." He smiled, and she was struck by how different his face looked when he smiled, younger and more open. "Tomorrow is Sunday. There is a church service in the morning and then a gathering in the afternoon. Would you consider coming? You do not have to talk to anyone if you do not want to, but it might be good for you to see more of the town, meet more people." "I do not think I am ready for that." "Fair enough, but the offer stands whenever you are ready." He started to turn away, then paused. "Grace, I know you do not believe it right now, but you are going to be all right. It might take time, but you will heal. I promise you that." Grace watched him leave, his words echoing in her mind. Promises were dangerous things. They implied a future, and she was not sure she had one of those. But something small and fragile stirred in her chest, something that might have been the faintest shadow of hope. She crushed it down before it could take root. Hope was the most painful thing of all. The days turned into a week, and then 2. Grace did not leave the boarding house, but she began to help Martha with small tasks. She washed dishes and folded laundry and swept floors, grateful for work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. Martha paid her in meals and continued lodging, and if it was charity, at least it was charity Grace could pretend she was earning. Garrett came by every few days, always with some excuse. He needed to pick up a package Martha was holding for him. He wanted to ask about getting his shirts laundered. He had brought fresh vegetables from a neighboring ranch and thought Martha might want some. Grace saw through the pretenses, understood that he was checking on her, but she did not call him out on it. His presence was somehow comforting, even though she tried not to rely on that comfort. One afternoon, he found her in the kitchen garden behind the boarding house, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans and squash. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, turning the sky shades of orange and gold. "Martha has you working hard," he observed, leaning against the fence. "I do not mind. It is better than sitting in my room thinking." Grace sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She had gained back some of the weight she had lost, and the bruises had faded. Physically, she was healing. The rest would take longer. "Have you thought any more about staying permanently?" Garrett asked. "About finding regular work. I think about it. But thinking and doing are different things." "What holds you back?" Grace pulled another weed, tossing it onto the pile beside her. "Fear, mostly. Fear that I will start to believe I can have a normal life again, and then something will happen to rip it away. Fear that I am too damaged to ever be normal. Fear that if people knew the whole truth about what happened to me, they would look at me differently. People in Hachita are not so judgmental as you might think," Garrett said. "Half the folks here are running from something or starting over from nothing. That is what the West is for, is it not? Second chances. Is that what you are doing, running from something?" He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. I came out here after Emma died because I could not stand to be in Texas anymore, in the places where she should have been but was not. I needed somewhere new, somewhere without memories." He pushed off from the fence, moving to crouch down beside her, his hands hanging loose between his knees. "But I learned something in the last 3 years. You cannot outrun grief or trauma. It follows you wherever you go. The only thing you can do is decide to stop running and face it, and that is a hell of a lot easier when you have people around who care about you." "Is that what you are?" "Someone who cares." The question came out more vulnerable than Grace intended. Garrett met her eyes, his expression serious. "Yes, I care about what happens to you, Grace. I know you do not understand why, and maybe I do not fully understand it myself. But I would like to be your friend if you will let me." Grace looked away first, her heart pounding. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to reach for the lifeline he was offering. But the fear was so strong, the certainty that anyone she let close would eventually hurt her or leave her or die. "I will think about it," she finally said. "That is all I ask." Garrett stood, dusting off his knees. "I am riding out to check on some cattle tomorrow, but I will be back in a few days. Maybe by then you will have come to a decision about staying." Grace watched him walk away, his long stride eating up the distance to where his horse was tied in front of the boarding house. She pressed her dirty hand against her chest, feeling her heart beat beneath her palm. Still alive. Still capable of fear and maybe, just maybe, capable of something else too. That night, she lay awake in her room, listening to the distant howl of coyotes and the closer sounds of the boarding house settling for the night. She thought about Frank, about the life they had tried to build and how quickly it had been destroyed. She thought about the men who had killed him, about their hands on her, and the way the world had narrowed down to nothing but pain and terror. She thought about the long walk through the desert, about how close she had come to simply lying down and letting death take her. And then she thought about Garrett's patient green eyes and Martha's gentle hands, and the wildflowers Sarah left on her windowsill each morning. She thought about the possibility of staying, of building something new from the ashes of what she had lost. It terrified her. But maybe being terrified was better than being numb. In the morning, Grace asked Martha if she knew of anyone who needed help with bookkeeping. Martha's face lit up. "Are you saying you want to stay?" "I am saying I want to try," Grace said carefully. "I cannot promise I will not panic and run, but I would like to try." Martha pulled her into a quick, fierce hug. "That is all anyone can do, sweetheart. Try." The general store was owned by a man named Samuel Chen, whose parents had come from China to work on the railroads and who had settled in Hachita to open a business serving the scattered ranches and farms in the area. He was a practical man in his 40s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner, and he looked Grace up and down when Martha brought her in. "You can read and write English?" he asked. "Yes, and do sums. My father was a school teacher in Philadelphia before he died. He made sure I was educated." Educated women are rare out here. Samuel gestured to the cluttered office at the back of the store. My books are a mess. My wife used to handle them, but she passed 2 years ago, and I have not had the head for it since. If you can make sense of this chaos, I will pay you $10 a month plus credit at the store. Grace looked at the stacks of receipts and ledgers piled haphazardly across the desk. It would take weeks to sort out. But it was honest work, and it was enough to live on, especially combined with the reduced rent Martha had offered in exchange for continued help around the boarding house. I can do it, she said. She started the next day, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of numbers and accounts. There was something soothing about bookkeeping, about the way everything had to balance, had to make sense. Her life might be chaos, but at least the ledgers could be brought into order. Samuel left her mostly alone, which she appreciated. He was not talkative by nature, and he did not pry into her past or ask uncomfortable questions. He brought her tea in the afternoons and occasionally pointed out errors she had missed, but otherwise let her work in peace. Grace fell into a routine. She woke early and helped Martha with breakfast for the boarders, then walked the short distance to the general store and worked until late afternoon. She spent her evenings helping with dinner preparation and doing mending or other household tasks. It was simple, predictable, and safe. She began to sleep through the night more often than not, though the nightmares still came sometimes, leaving her gasping and sweating in the darkness. Garrett returned after 5 days, riding into town dusty and tired but with that same easy smile. He found Grace at the general store, bent over the ledgers with ink stains on her fingers. I heard you took a job, he said from the doorway. I am glad. Grace looked up, startled to realize how glad she was to see him. She had missed him, which was both surprising and alarming. You were right about there being work available, though I think Samuel hired me partly out of desperation. His books were a disaster. Are, but they are becoming less of one. She set down her pen, flexing her cramped hand. How were your cattle, ornery as ever? One of the young bulls decided to make a break for it, and we spent half a day chasing him down. Garrett stepped into the office, looking at the stacks of organized receipts. You have been busy. It keeps me occupied. That is important. It is. But you need to do more than just work, Grace. You need to live too, she tensed. I am living. You are surviving. There is a difference. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy? Grace could not remember. Before Frank died, certainly. Maybe even before they had come west, back when life had been simpler. Happiness is not exactly a priority right now. Maybe it should be. Even small happinesses, little moments of peace or joy or just not hurting. He pushed off from the doorframe. Come have dinner with me tonight. Not at the boarding house, somewhere else. There is a little cantina at the edge of town that makes excellent tamales. I do not think that is a good idea. Why not? Because it felt too much like moving forward, like accepting that she could have normal things like dinners and conversations, and maybe even friendship. Because she was afraid of wanting anything too much. Because Garrett was kind and patient and looked at her like she was a person worth saving, and that was more dangerous than anything. I am not ready, she said instead. All right. But when you are, the offer stands. He tipped his hat to her and left, and Grace sat staring at her ledgers, the numbers swimming in front of her eyes. That night, she lay in bed and imagined what it might be like to go to dinner with Garrett Pierce. To sit across from him at a table and talk about inconsequential things, to laugh at something he said, to feel normal for an hour or two. The image was so appealing and so frightening that she could not sleep for hours, her mind circling around the possibility like a wary animal. What if she tried and failed? What if she had a panic attack in the middle of the restaurant? What if she let herself care about him and then something terrible happened? But what if she did not try? What if she spent the rest of her life hiding behind her fear, never risking anything, never reaching for even the smallest bit of happiness? The questions had no easy answers. The weeks passed, and autumn crept into the New Mexico desert. The brutal heat eased into warm days and cool nights, and Grace continued her routine of work and helping at the boarding house. She became a familiar sight in Hachita, the quiet woman who worked at the general store and kept to herself. People nodded greetings when they saw her, and she learned to nod back, to offer small smiles even when she did not feel them. Garrett continued to stop by regularly, always with some excuse, always careful not to push too hard. He brought her books from the ranch, a small collection left behind by the previous owner. He told her stories about the cattle and the other ranch hands, making her laugh despite herself with tales of their antics. He taught her how to identify the different birds that gathered at the water trough behind the boarding house, pointing out the curve of a hawk's wing or the bright flash of a bluebird. Slowly, carefully, Grace began to trust him. Not fully, not with the deepest parts of herself, but with the everyday moments. She found herself looking forward to his visits, to the way his presence made the world feel a little less heavy. One October evening, he found her sitting on the back porch of the boarding house, wrapped in a shawl and watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of purple and gold. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Grace shook her head and he settled onto the step beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him but not so close as to crowd her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade. "I have been thinking," Grace finally said, "about what you said. About doing things that make me happy. And I think I would like to take you up on that dinner offer if it is still available." She could feel him smile even without looking at him. "It is definitely still available. How about tomorrow evening?" "All right, tomorrow." It was both a tiny thing and an enormous one, this agreement to share a meal. Grace's heart raced with anxiety, but beneath that was something else. Anticipation, maybe, or the fragile beginning of joy. Garrett stood, reaching down to help her up. His hand was warm and calloused in hers, strong and steady. "I will pick you up at 6. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched him walk away into the gathering dusk, and then she went inside and told Martha she would need to borrow the blue dress for tomorrow night. Martha's delighted grin told Grace that the whole town would probably know about her dinner with Garrett by morning, but she found she did not mind as much as she thought she would. Let them talk. She was done hiding. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Grace made mistakes in the ledgers that she had to correct, her mind too occupied with the coming evening to focus properly. Samuel noticed her distraction but said nothing, just shook his head with what might have been amusement. At 5 o'clock, Grace returned to the boarding house and took more care with her appearance than she had in months. She washed thoroughly at the basin, scrubbing away the dust and ink stains. She put on the blue dress, grateful that she had gained back enough weight for it to fit properly. She brushed out her dark hair and pinned it up, leaving a few tendrils loose around her face. When she looked at herself in the small mirror, she saw a woman who looked almost normal, almost whole. The frightened, broken woman who had stumbled into Hachita 2 months ago was still there beneath the surface, but she was no longer the only thing Grace could see when she looked at her reflection. Garrett arrived promptly at 6, wearing clean clothes and with his dark hair still damp from his own washing. His eyes widened when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Grace's cheeks flush. "Thank you. You look nice too." They walked through the town as the sun set. Grace acutely aware of the curious glances from people on the street. But Garrett seemed unbothered. His stride relaxed as he pointed out various buildings and told her stories about the town's brief history. The cantina was small and warm, run by a Mexican family who had been in the area long before the Americans arrived. The walls were painted bright colors, and the air smelled of spices and cooking meat. Garrett led her to a table in the corner, away from the few other diners. "This is nice," Grace said, looking around. "Miguel's family makes the best food in 3 counties. I eat here at least once a week." Garrett signaled to the owner, who came over with a warm smile. They exchanged greetings in Spanish, Garrett's accent surprisingly good, and then Miguel was taking their orders and returning with cold drinks. Grace sipped hers carefully, the unfamiliar taste of lime and some kind of fruit making her blink. "What is this?" "Agua fresca. Miguel's wife makes it." "Good, is it not?" "It is different, but yes, good." They fell into easy conversation, Garrett telling her about his work at the ranch, the challenges of managing cattle in the desert climate. Grace found herself relaxing, the anxiety that had gripped her all day slowly loosening its hold. When the food arrived, she ate with genuine hunger, the tamales as good as Garrett had promised. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said when they were halfway through the meal. Grace tensed slightly but nodded. "What did you do before you came west? You said your father was a teacher." "He was. He had a small school in Philadelphia. I helped him sometimes, teaching the younger children their letters." Grace smiled at the memory, surprised that she could think of it without pain. "After he died, I worked in a dress shop for a while. That is where I met Frank. He used to come in to buy things for his mother, and we started talking. He had dreams of finding silver out west, of making a fortune. I thought it sounded like an adventure. But it was not. No, it was hard and dirty and isolating. We lived in a tent at first, then a shack made of scrap wood. Frank worked from dawn to dusk, and I tried to keep us fed and clean and hopeful. For a while, it seemed like it might pay off. He found a decent vein of silver, enough to file a claim. But then the others wanted it." Her voice had gone flat again, and she had to force herself to keep talking. "I try not to think too much about what happened after that." Garrett reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. "I am sorry you went through that. No one should have to endure what you did. But I did endure it. I survived." She met his eyes. "Some days I am still not sure if that was a blessing or a curse." "A blessing," Garrett said firmly. "Definitely a blessing. Because you are here now and you are healing and you have a whole life ahead of you. How can you be so sure? Because I see it in you, the strength. You walked through the desert alone after being left for dead. You got up every day even when you wanted to give up. You started working again, started building something new. That takes more courage than you probably realize." Grace looked down at her plate, emotions swirling in her chest. "I do not feel courageous. I feel scared all the time. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing the thing anyway, even though you are terrified. By that measure, you are one of the bravest people I know." She wanted to argue to deflect the compliment, but the sincerity in his voice stopped her. Instead, she just said, "Thank you." They finished the meal talking about lighter things, and when Garrett walked her back to the boarding house under a sky full of stars, Grace realized she had enjoyed herself. Actually enjoyed an evening, laughed at jokes, felt like a normal person doing normal things. It was both strange and wonderful. At the door to the boarding house, Garrett stopped. "I had a really good time tonight, Grace." "So did I. Thank you for pushing me to do this." "Anytime." He hesitated, then said, "Could I take you out again, maybe next week?" Grace felt fear flutter in her stomach, but beneath it was something stronger. Want, hope. The beginning of belief that maybe she could have this, could have someone who cared, could have a future that held more than just survival. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Garrett's smile was bright enough to rival the stars. "Good. I will see you soon then." Grace watched him walk away, and then she went inside, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat on her bed in the darkness, pressing her hand against her racing heart. Something was changing inside her, some frozen place beginning to thaw. It hurt, the way warming always hurt after being cold for too long, but it was a good hurt. A healing hurt. For the first time since Frank died, Grace let herself imagine a future, let herself hope. The next weeks were a revelation. Garrett took Grace to dinner again, and then on a ride out to see the ranch where he worked. She met the other cowboys, gruff men who treated her with rough courtesy and did not ask invasive questions. She saw the vast herds of cattle moving across the scrubland, watched Garrett work with easy competence, admired the way he gentled a skittish horse with patience and soft words. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Garrett told her about growing up in Texas, about his parents who had died of cholera when he was 16, about raising Emma by himself, and then losing her just when they were supposed to have a fresh start together. Grace told him about Philadelphia, about the dress shop and her dreams of adventure, about Frank and the good parts of their marriage before it all went wrong. She did not tell him everything. Some things were still too raw, too shameful. But she told him enough that he understood, and he never pushed for more than she was willing to share. Grace found herself smiling more, laughing more. The nightmares came less frequently. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have this, could have happiness, could have Garrett. Because it was becoming increasingly clear that what she felt for him was not just gratitude or friendship. She caught herself watching him when he was not looking, noticing the way his hands moved when he talked, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. She felt her heart lift when she saw him coming down the street. She thought about him at night, alone in her room, and felt a longing that was both sweet and terrifying. Grace had not thought she would ever want to be touched again after what those men had done to her. But she wanted Garrett to touch her, wanted it with an intensity that surprised her. She was falling in love with him, had probably been falling for a while, she just had not let herself acknowledge it. The realization came one November afternoon when they were sitting by the stock tank at the edge of town, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Garrett was telling her a story about a cattle drive he had been on years ago, his hands gesturing animatedly. And Grace found herself thinking that she wanted to spend the rest of her life listening to him talk, wanted to wake up next to him and fall asleep in his arms and build a life with him. The force of the wanting made her breath catch. Garrett noticed immediately. "Grace, are you all right?" "I am fine, I just—" She trailed off, not sure how to put it into words. How did you tell someone that they had become your whole world without sounding desperate or broken? But Garrett was watching her with those patient green eyes, and she realized that maybe she did not have to explain. Maybe he already knew. "I care about you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "More than I thought I could care about anyone ever again. And that terrifies me because what if I lose you? What if something happens and I have to go through that kind of pain again?" Garrett shifted closer, taking her hand in both of his. His touch was warm and gentle, his calluses rough against her skin. "Life does not come with guarantees, Grace. Bad things can happen no matter how careful we are, but that does not mean we should not reach for the good things when they are offered. That does not mean we should live in fear. I do not know how to not be afraid. Then be afraid, but do not let the fear stop you from living." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "I care about you too, so much that it scares me sometimes. But I would rather have this, have you in my life even with the risk, than spend the rest of my days playing it safe and regretting what I did not try for." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I am falling in love with you, Grace Novak. Have been for weeks now, and I think maybe you feel the same way about me." "I do," she whispered. "I do feel the same way, but Garrett, I am so broken." "What if I cannot be what you need?" He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. "You are not broken. You are healing. There is a difference, and I do not need you to be anything other than what you are. You do not understand. What those men did to me after Frank died, I do not know if I can." She could not finish the sentence, shame and fear choking the words. "Then we will take it slow," Garrett said softly. "We will go at whatever pace you need. There is no rush, Grace. I am not going anywhere." She looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and patience and love. So much love that it made her chest ache. And she realized that she believed him. He would wait for her. He would be patient. He would help her heal in whatever way she needed. Grace leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief and tentative kiss that held all her hope and fear and love. Garrett kissed her back gently, carefully, his hand cradling her face like she was something precious. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. "I love you," Grace said, the words feeling right and true even through her fear. "I love you too," Garrett said. "And we are going to be all right, I promise you that." Grace wanted to believe him, and maybe, for the first time, she actually did. They courted properly after that, with all the rituals small-town propriety demanded. Garrett called on Grace at the boarding house, and they took walks together in the evening. They attended church services together, sat side by side with the hymnal shared between them. They had dinner at the cantina and attended the occasional social gathering, though Grace still found crowds difficult and usually left early. The town watched their courtship with approval. Garrett Pierce was well-liked and respected, and Grace had proven herself a hard worker and a decent person. People began to include her more, the women inviting her to help with the church bazaar, the men nodding greetings when she passed. She was becoming part of the fabric of Hachita, no longer an outsider but one of them. Martha was delighted by the romance, beaming every time Garrett came to call. "I knew it," she said to Grace one evening. "I knew he was sweet on you from the moment he brought you to my door. You did not say anything." "Would you have listened if I had?" Martha laughed. "You were too busy trying to convince yourself you did not deserve happiness." "I am glad you figured out you were wrong about that," Grace smiled, helping Martha fold laundry. "I am glad too, though I still have moments where I am sure I am going to wake up and find out this was all a dream." "It is not a dream. It is your life, and you have earned every bit of happiness in it." Martha gave her a stern look. "Do not let the past steal your future, Grace. What happened to you was terrible, but it does not define you. You get to decide who you are and what you want, and no one can take that away from you." The words settled into Grace's heart, a counterweight to the fear that still lived there. She was more than what had been done to her. She was more than her trauma. She was a woman who had survived and was now learning to live again, and that was something to be proud of. In December, Garrett asked her to marry him. They were at the ranch, standing in the cold December air watching the stars come out over the desert. The wind was sharp, and Grace was wrapped in her warmest shawl, but she felt warm beside Garrett, their shoulders touching. "I have been thinking," Garrett said, his breath fogging in the cold air, "about the future, about what I want my life to look like." "And what do you want it to look like?" Grace asked, though she thought she might know the answer. "I want it to look like this, you and me together. Building something real." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Grace, I know we have only been courting for a couple of months, and I know you are still healing from everything you went through, but I also know that I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. So I am asking, even though it might be too soon, even though you might say no, will you marry me?" Grace felt tears well up, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Garrett let out a whoop of joy and spun her around, both of them laughing in the cold night air. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, and Grace kissed him back with all the love and hope and trust she had been building over the past months. "When?" she asked when they finally pulled apart. "Whenever you are ready. Tomorrow or next month or next year. I just want to know you are mine and I am yours." "Spring," Grace decided. "Let us get married in the spring. That gives us time to plan, and it gives me time to be completely sure I am ready for this. Are you not sure now?" "I am sure I love you. I am sure I want to be with you. But marriage is more than that, Garrett. It means sharing a bed and a life and everything that comes with it. I need to know I can handle that, and right now I am still working through some things." Garrett nodded, his expression understanding. "Spring it is, then. We will get married when the desert blooms, and it will be perfect." Grace leaned into him, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. She was scared, yes. But she was also happy, and that happiness was growing stronger every day, pushing back the darkness that had consumed her for so long. Winter passed slowly in Hachita. Grace continued to work at the general store, saving her wages for the wedding and the life she would build with Garrett. She moved out of the boarding house in February, taking a small room above the general store so that Martha could rent her old room to new boarders. It was a tiny space, barely large enough for a bed and a trunk and a small table, but it was hers. A place of her own where she could think and plan and dream. Garrett came by almost every evening, and they would sit together in her little room or take walks through the town, talking about their plans. Garrett wanted to buy a piece of land eventually, build a small ranch of his own. Grace wanted to keep working for a while, saving money and building their nest egg. They talked about children, both agreeing they wanted them, but that there was no rush. Grace needed time to be ready for that, and Garrett was willing to wait. They talked about everything except the wedding night. That loomed in Grace's mind like a shadow, a test she was not sure she could pass. She knew Garrett wanted her, saw the heat in his eyes when they kissed, felt the tension in his body when he held her. But he never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. One March evening, Grace finally gathered the courage to bring it up. They were sitting in her room, Garrett in the single chair while Grace perched on the edge of her bed. The lamp cast soft shadows across the small space. "I need to tell you something," Grace said, her hands twisting in her lap. "About what happened to me after Frank died." Garrett leaned forward, his expression serious. "You do not have to tell me anything you are not ready to share. I know, but I think I need to say it. I think I need you to understand what you are getting into by marrying me. All right?" "I am listening." Grace took a deep breath, forcing the words out. "The men who killed Frank, they did not just kill him. They hurt me first, made him watch. And then after he was dead, they used me, all of them, for hours, until I was so broken I wished I could die too." The words came out flat and hard, a recitation of horror. "I know you want a proper marriage, Garrett. I know what husbands and wives do together. But I do not know if I can do that, if I can let any man touch me that way again, even you." Garrett was silent for a long moment, and Grace could not bring herself to look at him, afraid of what she would see in his face. Disgust, maybe, or pity, or regret that he had gotten himself entangled with damaged goods. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Grace, look at me." She forced herself to raise her head. His eyes were wet, tears tracking down his cheeks, but his expression was not pitying or disgusted. It was furious and heartbroken and full of love. I am so sorry that happened to you, he said, his voice rough. So damn sorry. And if I could find those men, I would kill every last one of them for what they did. But Grace, that does not change how I feel about you. It does not make me want you any less. It just makes me want to spend the rest of my life showing you that not all men are monsters, that you are safe with me, that I will never, ever hurt you. But what about our wedding night? What about? She could not finish the question. What about it? Grace, I am not marrying you for your body. I am marrying you because I love you, because you are smart and strong and brave. Because you make me laugh and make me want to be a better man. If we never make love, that will not change how much I want to be your husband. He stood and crossed to the bed, kneeling in front of her so their eyes were level. We will figure it out together, at whatever pace you need. And if you are never ready, then we will find other ways to be close. But I am not walking away from you because of what was done to you. Do you understand? Grace felt something break open inside her, a dam she had been holding against the flood of emotion. She started to cry deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, and Garrett pulled her into his arms, holding her while she wept out months of pain and fear and shame. I love you, she gasped between sobs. I love you so much and I am so scared. I love you too, and I know you are scared. But we are going to be all right. I promise you, Grace. We are going to be all right. They sat there for a long time, Grace crying while Garrett held her, until the storm passed and she was left feeling exhausted but lighter, like she had purged something poisonous from her system. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. For what? For not running. For staying even when I gave you every reason to leave. Garrett pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I am not going anywhere, Grace. You are stuck with me now, she laughed, a watery sound but genuine. I think I can live with that. They set the wedding date for mid-April, when the desert would be at its most beautiful, the cacti blooming and the air not yet too hot. Martha insisted on hosting the reception at the boarding house, and the whole town seemed to be involved in the preparations. Grace was overwhelmed by the kindness, by the way people rallied around her and Garrett, treating their wedding like it mattered. Samuel gave Grace a generous gift of credit at the general store for household goods. The women from the church made her a quilt, each square stitched with care. Garrett's fellow ranch hands took up a collection and bought them a good set of dishes. Even Miguel from the cantina offered to provide food for the reception at cost. Grace had never felt so surrounded by community, so supported and cared for. It was almost enough to make her forget that 6 months ago she had been stumbling into town half dead, and convinced she would never know kindness again. The week before the wedding, Garrett took her to see the small house he had rented for them on the outskirts of town. It was a simple adobe structure with 2 rooms and a small kitchen area, but it had a good roof and sturdy walls and windows that let in plenty of light. It is not much, Garrett said as they stood in the empty main room, but it is a start. We can add on as we save money, maybe build a proper bedroom and a parlor. Grace walked slowly through the space, imagining how it would look with furniture and curtains and the small personal touches that would make it a home. It is perfect, she said. I love it. You do, I do. It is ours, Garrett, our place to build a life together. How could I not love it? He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Grace tensed for just a moment, the old fear rising, but then she made herself relax into his embrace. This was Garrett. He was safe. He loved her. I am going to make you happy, he murmured. That is my only job now, making sure you are happy and safe and loved every single day. You already do that, Grace said, covering his hands with hers. You have been doing that since the day you found me in the street. Then I will just keep doing it for the next 50 or 60 years. Grace smiled, turning in his arms to kiss him. The fear was still there, probably would always be there to some degree, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. Now there was love and hope and the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, she could have this, could have a future, could have happiness, could have Garrett. The wedding took place on a perfect April afternoon with the desert blooming around them and half the town in attendance. Grace wore a dress that Martha and the other women had helped her make, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Sarah had gathered that morning, brilliant splashes of yellow and purple and red. Garrett stood at the front of the small church in his best suit, his dark hair slicked back and his eyes bright with emotion. When Grace walked down the aisle on Samuel's arm, the Chinese shopkeeper having volunteered to stand in for her absent father, Garrett's smile was so full of love that Grace felt her own eyes sting with tears. The ceremony was simple, the words familiar and comforting. Grace's voice shook when she said her vows, but she meant every word. She promised to love and honor Garrett, to stand by him through whatever came, to build a life together. And when he slipped the simple gold band on her finger, she felt something settle into place in her chest. A sense of rightness, of home. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the pastor said. "You may kiss your bride." Garrett cupped Grace's face in his hands and kissed her softly, sweetly, and the small congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Grace kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears, and felt joy bloom in her chest like the flowers blooming in the desert. She was married. She was Mrs. Garrett Pierce. She had a husband who loved her and a town that accepted her and a future that held possibility instead of just pain. The reception at the boarding house was lively and warm, full of food and music and laughter. Grace danced with Garrett, letting him lead her through the steps even though she was clumsy and kept stepping on his feet. She danced with Samuel and with Henry from the livery stable and with Tom, the young man who had been passing through and had ended up staying in Hachita. She ate wedding cake that Martha had baked and accepted congratulations from what felt like every person in town. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Garrett leaned close and whispered, "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Pierce, Mrs. Pierce?" The name sent a thrill through her. "Yes, I think I am." They said their goodbyes and slipped away, walking hand in hand through the darkening streets to the little adobe house that was now theirs. Someone, probably Martha, had lit lamps inside so that warm light spilled through the windows. Garrett had moved in his few possessions over the past week, and Grace had brought her small trunk over that morning. It already looked like a home. Inside, Grace felt her nervousness return. This was the part she had been dreading, the test she was not sure she would pass. She stood in the middle of the main room, her hands clasped in front of her, and tried to breathe. Garrett closed the door and turned to face her. "Grace," he said softly, "come here." She crossed to him, and he took her hands, bringing them to his lips. "I meant what I said before. We do this at your pace. Whatever you are comfortable with, that is what we will do. There is no pressure, no expectation. I just want to hold you if you will let me. Just hold me, just hold you, unless you want more. But that is up to you, Grace. You are in control here." The words released something in her chest, some tight knot of fear. She was in control, not him, not the ghosts of those other men, her. She got to decide what happened next. "I think I would like to try," she said quietly. "To be a real wife to you, but I need you to be patient, to go slow. To stop if I ask you to. I promise. All of those things." Garrett led her to the bedroom, the small space dominated by the bed that Martha had helped them purchase. "We will go as slow as you need, and if we need to stop, we will stop. No matter what, all right." Grace nodded, her heart hammering. Garrett helped her out of her dress, his movements gentle and careful, talking to her the whole time. telling her how beautiful she was, how much he loved her, how lucky he was to be her husband. His voice was a lifeline, something to hold on to as old fears tried to surface. When they were both undressed and lying on the bed, Garrett pulled her close but made no move to do more than hold her. "We can just sleep like this if you want," he said. "There is no rush." But Grace found that she did not want to wait. She wanted to reclaim this part of herself, wanted to replace the terrible memories with new ones, wanted to know if she could experience pleasure instead of pain. "I want to try," she said. "Please, Garrett, help me do this." He kissed her then, slowly and deeply, his hands moving over her body with exquisite gentleness. He touched her like she was precious, like she mattered, like every part of her was worthy of care and attention. When Grace tensed or pulled back, he stopped immediately, gave her time to breathe and settle, never showing frustration or impatience. It was nothing like what those men had done to her. This was tender and careful and full of love. This was Garrett showing her without words that she was safe, that she was cherished, that her body was her own and could bring her joy instead of just pain. When they finally came together, Grace cried. But they were good tears, tears of release and healing and the beginning of wholeness. Garrett held her through it, kissing her tears away, telling her how much he loved her, how proud he was of her courage. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Grace's head on Garrett's chest and his arms around her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I am more than all right," Grace said, and she meant it. She felt raw and vulnerable, but also strong in a way she had not felt in months. She had faced the thing she feared most and survived it, more than survived it. She had found pleasure and connection and love. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For being patient, for being kind, for loving me enough to help me heal." Garrett kissed the top of her head. "You did the healing, Grace. You did the hard work. I just got to be here to support you through it." Grace smiled in the darkness. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been healing herself all along, and Garrett had just provided the safe space for that healing to happen. Either way, she was grateful. Grateful for his love, grateful for his patience, grateful that she had been brave enough to let herself hope. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Grace woke in the morning to sunlight streaming through the window and Garrett's peaceful face beside her, she felt something she had not felt in nearly a year. She felt happy. The first months of marriage were a time of adjustment and joy. Grace continued to work at the general store, though now she came home each evening to a husband instead of an empty room. She and Garrett developed a comfortable rhythm, sharing meals and conversations and the small intimacies of daily life. Their physical relationship continued to improve as Grace grew more confident and comfortable. There were still moments when she tensed or pulled away, when old memories intruded, but Garrett was always patient, always willing to stop and give her time. And gradually, those moments became less frequent. Grace was reclaiming her body, learning that it could be a source of pleasure and connection instead of pain. In June, Garrett came home with news. The ranch owner was selling off some of his land, and Garrett had been offered the chance to buy 100 acres at a good price. "It would mean taking out a loan," he told Grace as they sat at their small kitchen table after supper. "And it would be years before we could build it into a profitable operation. But it would be ours, Grace. Our own land, our own ranch." Grace thought about it, running the numbers in her head. It would be tight financially and they would have to work hard, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to build something lasting. "I think we should do it," she said. "It is a risk, but it is the kind of risk worth taking." Garrett's face lit up. "You mean it?" "I mean it. Let us buy our land and build our future." They purchased the 100 acres in July, a stretch of scrubland with a small creek running through it and enough grazing to support a modest herd. Garrett continued to work at the big ranch for wages while slowly building up their own stock. Grace kept her job at the general store, her salary helping to make the loan payments and buy supplies. It was hard work, exhausting and sometimes discouraging. But it was their work, building toward their dream, and that made all the difference. On Sundays, they would ride out to their land and sit by the creek, talking about their plans. A house here, corrals there, eventually a barn, maybe some chickens and a milk cow. Children playing in the yard, children. Grace was not sure she was ready for that yet, but the idea no longer filled her with dread. She could imagine it now, could picture a little boy with Garrett's green eyes or a little girl with her dark hair. Could imagine herself as a mother, loving and protecting a child the way she had not been protected. In September, Grace missed her monthly courses. She did not say anything at first, not wanting to get Garrett's hopes up in case she was wrong. But when she missed a second month and began to feel nauseated in the mornings, she went to see the town's midwife. "You are with child," the midwife, a practical woman named Mrs. Henderson, confirmed. "Looks to be about 2 months along. Should have a baby around April if all goes well." Grace walked home in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat belly. A baby. She was going to have a baby. The news filled her with a complicated mix of emotions, joy and terror, excitement and anxiety. She had not planned this, had not been sure she was ready. But it was happening, and she would have to find a way to be ready. When she told Garrett that evening, he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby, Grace, we are going to have a baby." His happiness was infectious, and Grace found herself laughing too, some of her anxiety easing. They would figure this out together, just like they had figured out everything else. "Are you happy?" Garrett asked, setting her down and studying her face. "Yes," Grace said, and realized it was true. "I am happy and scared, but mostly happy." "We are going to be good parents," Garrett said. "I know it." "How can you be so sure?" "Because we know what it is like to hurt. We know what it is like to need kindness and not receive it. So we will make sure our child always knows they are loved and safe. That is all any kid really needs." Grace hugged him tightly, breathing in his familiar scent. He was right. They would love this child fiercely, protect them, raise them to be strong and kind. And if Grace still had nightmares sometimes, if she still had moments of fear and doubt, well, that was all right. She was allowed to be imperfect. She was allowed to still be healing even as she built a new life. The pregnancy was not easy. Grace was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down. She had to cut back her hours at the general store, and there were days when she was so exhausted she could barely get out of bed. But Garrett was wonderful, caring for her with endless patience, bringing her crackers to settle her stomach and rubbing her feet when they swelled. As her belly grew and the baby began to move inside her, Grace felt a fierce protectiveness rise up. This child would never know the kind of pain she had endured. This child would grow up safe and loved and free. She would make sure of it. In March, as her due date approached, Grace found herself thinking more and more about her own mother, who had died when Grace was 15. She wished her mother could be there to meet her grandchild, to give advice and support. But Martha stepped into that role with her usual kindness, coming by regularly to check on Grace and prepare her for what to expect during the birth. "It is going to hurt," Martha said frankly one afternoon as they sat in Grace's kitchen. "I will not lie to you about that, but it is a different kind of hurt from what you have experienced before. This hurt has purpose. It brings life instead of taking it." Grace appreciated the honesty. She was not afraid of pain anymore. She had survived worse. When her labor started on a warm April evening, Grace was ready. She sent Garrett to fetch Mrs. Henderson while Martha stayed with her, timing the contractions and offering encouragement. The labor was long, lasting through the night and into the next day, but Grace bore it with gritted teeth and determination. She had survived so much worse than this. She could bring her child into the world, finally, as the sun was setting on the second day. Mrs. Henderson said, "All right, Grace, it is time to push." Grace pushed with every ounce of strength she had left, and then there was a cry, sharp and indignant, filling the room with the sound of new life. "It is a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, laying the baby on Grace's chest. "A healthy boy." Grace looked down at her son, at his red, scrunched face and tiny fists, and felt love crash over her like a wave. This was her child, hers and Garrett's, a new life built from the ashes of her old one. Garrett came in then, his face anxious until he saw them both. "Grace, is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "Come meet your son." Garrett approached the bed carefully, his eyes wide with wonder as he looked at the baby. "He is so small," he whispered. "But healthy and strong," Mrs. Henderson assured him. "You have a fine boy there." "What should we name him?" Garrett asked, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. Grace had been thinking about this for months. "I want to name him Frank," she said. "After my first husband. He deserved to have his name live on, even if he did not get to live himself." Garrett met her eyes, and Grace saw understanding there. He knew she had loved Frank, knew that loving him did not diminish what she felt for Garrett. They were different loves, both real and valid. "Frank Pierce," Garrett said softly. "I think that is perfect." Little Frank, as they called him to distinguish him from his namesake, was a good baby. He nursed well and slept in reasonable stretches, and Grace found that motherhood came more naturally to her than she had expected. She loved the weight of her son in her arms, the sweet, milky smell of him, the way he looked at her with unfocused eyes that would eventually turn the same green as his father's. Garrett was a devoted father, taking turns walking the floor with Frank when he fussed at night, changing nappies without complaint, spending hours just staring at his son in wonder. Watching them together made Grace's heart swell with love and gratitude. Life settled into a new rhythm. Grace stayed home with Frank while Garrett worked both his job at the big ranch and their own growing operation. It was hard, and they were often tired and short on money, but they were building something real. Their herd grew slowly, a few head at a time. They saved every penny they could toward building a proper house on their land. When Frank was 6 months old, Grace started bringing him out to their property, laying him on a blanket in the shade while she and Garrett worked on clearing land and planning where everything would go. The baby seemed to love being outside, gurgling happily at the birds and the play of sunlight through the leaves. "He is going to grow up to be a rancher," Garrett said one afternoon, watching Frank grab at the grass with chubby fists. "I can already tell." Grace smiled, leaning against her husband. "Maybe, or maybe he will want to be something completely different, a teacher like my father or a shopkeeper like Samuel, or something we cannot even imagine yet. Whatever he wants to be, we will support him," Garrett said. "As long as he is happy and good to people, that is all that matters." Grace thought about how far she had come from the broken woman who had stumbled into Hachita nearly 2 years ago. She had a husband who loved her, a healthy son, a home and a future. She still had scars, both physical and emotional. She still had bad days when the memories came back too vividly, but they no longer defined her. She was more than her trauma. She was a wife and mother and friend and valued member of her community. She was Grace Pierce, and she was happy. The years passed, and the Pierce family grew and thrived. When Frank was 3, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, after Garrett's sister. Emma was a serious baby who watched everything with solemn eyes before rewarding them with a rare smile that lit up her whole face. 2 years after Emma came another son, Robert, who was loud and energetic from the moment he entered the world. And 2 years after that, twin daughters arrived unexpectedly, Clara and Rose, identical except for a small birthmark on Rose's left shoulder. The little adobe house became too crowded, so Garrett built a larger house on their ranch land, a solid structure with 4 bedrooms and a real parlor. They moved in when the twins were 6 months old, and Grace stood in her new kitchen and marveled at how much her life had changed. She had 5 children, 5 healthy, happy children who would never know hunger or fear or neglect. She had a husband who still made her heart flutter when he smiled at her. She had a home and land and a future full of possibility. "Are you happy?" Garrett asked her that first night in the new house, after the children were all asleep, and they were lying in their bedroom with the window open to let in the cool evening breeze. "I am more than happy," Grace said. "I am blessed. We both are." Garrett pulled her close and Grace nestled into his embrace, the way she had done countless times over the years. She felt safe here, cherished and loved. "Do you ever think about that day I found you?" Garrett asked quietly. "About how different things could have been if you had collapsed one street over or if I had not been in town that day?" "Sometimes," Grace admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. We cannot live in the what-ifs. We can only live in the what is." "And what is this?" "This is everything I never thought I could have. This is healing and hope and love." Grace lifted her head to look at him. "You gave me kindness when I had no reason to expect it. You were patient when I was difficult. You loved me when I could not love myself. You saved my life, Garrett." "No," Garrett said, cupping her face in his hand. "You saved your own life. I just got to be part of your journey." Grace kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. He was wrong, she thought. They had saved each other. He had given her the safety and support she needed to heal, and she had given him someone to care for, a family to replace the one he had lost. They had built something beautiful together from the broken pieces of their pasts. The children grew, and the ranch prospered. Frank became the serious, responsible eldest child, helping his father with the cattle and learning the business. Emma was the dreamer, always with her nose in a book or making up elaborate stories for her younger siblings. Robert was the wild one, always getting into scrapes and coming home dirty and grinning. And the twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in a language only they understood. Grace watched them grow with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. They were growing up so fast, her babies turning into children and then into young people with their own dreams and personalities. But she was grateful for every moment, even the difficult ones. Especially the difficult ones because they meant she was living, truly living instead of just surviving. The town of Hachita grew too. More families arrived, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity. A proper school was built and Grace served on the board, using her father's teaching legacy to help shape the education of the next generation. A telegraph line came through, connecting them to the wider world. The general store expanded, and Samuel hired 2 additional clerks to help with the increased business. Martha grew older and eventually retired from running the boarding house, though she remained a fixture in town and a beloved grandmother figure to the Pierce children. Sarah married Tom, the young man who had been passing through and stayed, and they opened a small restaurant that became the social heart of Hachita. Grace and Garrett grew older too. Silver threaded through their hair, and lines appeared at the corners of their eyes. But their love remained strong, deepened by shared experiences and the life they had built together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Grace back to the stock tank where they had first realized they loved each other. The town had grown up around it, but the tank remained, now surrounded by a small park with benches and shade trees. They sat on one of the benches, holding hands and watching the sun set just as they had done all those years ago. 20 years, Garrett marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I carried you to Martha's boarding house, and sometimes it feels like you have been in my life forever. Both can be true, Grace said. Time is strange like that. You have any regrets? Garrett asked. Anything you wish had been different? Grace thought about it. She regretted the pain she had endured, the loss of Frank and the trauma that had broken her for a time. But she could not regret the path that had brought her here to this moment with this man and their beautiful family. No, she finally said. I do not regret anything. Every experience, good and bad, made me who I am, and I like who I am now. So do I, Garrett said, bringing her hand to his lips. I love who you are, Grace Pierce. I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Grace said. You gave me kindness when I thought the world had no kindness left. You gave me hope when I had given up on hoping. You gave me a life worth living. They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of Hachita settling in for the evening, familiar and comforting. Grace thought about the woman she had been 20 years ago, broken and bleeding and convinced she would never be whole again. That woman would not recognize the person she had become, would not believe that healing was possible, that happiness could be rebuilt from ruins. But Grace knew better now. She knew that even the deepest wounds could heal given time and care. She knew that kindness was a powerful force, capable of transforming lives. She knew that love, real and patient and true, could mend even the most shattered heart. She had been too broken to hope for kindness once. But Garrett had given her kindness anyway, without expectation or condition, and that kindness had changed everything. It had given her the space and safety to heal, to grow, to become someone capable of loving and being loved in return. Grace leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, and smiled. Her life had not been easy. She carried scars that would never fully fade. But she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. She had built a family and a home and a legacy of love that would continue long after she was gone, and that, she thought, was more than enough. The desert night fell around them, vast and beautiful and full of stars, and Grace Pierce was happy. Completely, thoroughly, genuinely happy. The broken woman who had stumbled into Hachita all those years ago was still part of her, always would be. But she was no longer defined by her brokenness. She was defined by her strength, her resilience, her capacity to heal and love and hope. She had been saved by kindness. And in turn, she had learned to give kindness to others, to her children and her neighbors and anyone who needed it. It was a legacy she was proud of, a ripple effect that would continue long after she was gone. Garrett squeezed her hand gently, and Grace squeezed back, a silent communication of love and understanding. They had weathered storms together and come out stronger. They had built a life from nothing, had raised children and grown old together, had loved each other through every challenge and triumph. "Ready to go home?" Garrett asked softly. "Yes," Grace said. "Let us go home." They walked hand in hand through the streets of Hachita, past the general store where Grace had once worked, past Martha's old boarding house, past the church where they had been married, past all the places that held their history, their memories, their love. At their house, light spilled from the windows, and they could hear the sounds of their children inside, the older ones visiting with their own families now. Frank with his wife and 2 sons, Emma with her husband and newborn daughter. Even Robert, usually off adventuring somewhere, was home for the anniversary celebration. Grace paused at the door, taking a moment to appreciate the beauty of it. This was her life. This noise and love and family. This home built on kindness and patience and hope. This future she had never dared to dream of when she was at her lowest. "Are you coming?" Garrett asked, holding the door open. "Yes," Grace said, stepping forward into the warmth and light and love. "I am coming." And as she crossed the threshold into her home, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, Grace sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For Garrett, who had seen past her brokenness to the woman she could become. For Martha and Samuel, and all the people of Hachita who had welcomed her and helped her heal. For her children, who filled her days with purpose and joy. For the strength she had found within herself to keep going even when giving up seemed easier. She had been broken once, too shattered to hope for anything beyond survival. But kindness had found her anyway, in the form of a green-eyed cowboy with a patient heart. And that kindness had given her the space to heal, to grow, to become whole again. It had not been easy. Healing never was. But it had been worth it. Every difficult moment, every painful step forward, every act of courage large and small. All of it had led her here, to this moment, to this life, to this family. Grace Pierce was happy, and she was grateful, and she was home.